evening, everybody.
Evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming to our program tonight. My name is Bailey Krell, and I'm the operations assistant here at the Jefferson. It's my pleasure to kick off today's event, and I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go over some housekeeping notes, tell you about our upcoming events, and then turn it over to our presenter. First, for some housekeeping, if you need assistance during the event, please find me or Chris in the back of the room, or Furky, but we'll just let him enjoy the presentation. And then for the questions portion at the end, please be sure to keep your questions brief and concise, and don't offer lengthy statements. If you want to talk to the presenter after the talk, that would be the best time to do so. Also, I would like to note, I'm going to be turning off all the lights for the presentation because this is to enhance the pictures on the screen. Don't fall asleep. If you do, we'll come over and wake you up. Or if you sleep, don't snore. How about that? And now to our upcoming events. Tomorrow at 7 p.m., Katie Phillips and Jacob Jones will be speaking about Hidden Voices, the unheard struggle of students at the JES. Then on Friday at noon, Seth Trott will be presenting a talk called Presque Isle Neighborhood Alliance, Uniting Neighbors to Build a Change. And finally, next week on Monday at 7 p.m., Dr. David Frew and Dr. Andrew Roth will deliver a lecture called Bay Rats and Bookworms. JES's Frew and Roth take their work from the page to the stage to celebrate 200-plus publications. And now I would like to introduce to you our presenter tonight, one of the Jefferson Scholars-in-Residence, Dr. Michael DeSanctis, and let's give him a warm JES welcome.
Well, that's very nice. How is everyone doing? None of you seems to have a social life of any kind. You're here tonight. I asked Bailey to turn the lights off because my presentations really do rise and fall on the quality of the image. So I hope you don't mind sitting in the darkness. You probably won't be able to see this right now very well, but afterwards you might take a peek. But I brought with me a file that I've had for 40 years. I came to Gannon in 1985. That's 40 years ago to teach at Gannon. This is a file, and it's likely the largest file I have in my file cabinets, my old Gannon cabinets. And I call this Controversial Works of Art. And you can imagine how over the years I had to collect so many images that really were contentious or controversial. We live in a culture that is controversial. I think the worst thing ever invented was the microphone and the blog site. Everybody seems to have an opinion nowadays. Not necessarily an informed opinion, but certainly an opinion. And actually this evening I want to talk a little bit about, or actually a lot about, how we inform our opinion when it comes to a work of art. Before I get too deeply into this, in the name of shameless self-promotion, I wanted to tell you that I have a new book out on the market. It's available at fine bookstores, wherever you can find them. It's also available online from Amazon. Some of you know, some of you who have been following my work since I left Gannon, know that about 3 years ago I began writing, as a way of giving back to the community, a column, a monthly column in the Senior News, that little tabloid, you know, that's available in places like grocery stores. It deals with senior spirituality. When I pitched this to the editors, it was after having read the Senior News myself and finding that it had articles on all kinds of subjects, from how to keep away from scams online and how to fix plumbing around your house. But I assume that, you know, elderly people have experienced death. And they know about death, and they know about the beauty of it, and also the terror of it. And they have a whole bushel basket full of spiritual experiences. And over the past 3 years, people have said, well, Michael, I've been clipping these things out of the newspaper. They really work well on the bottom of my bird cage or on my refrigerator. Why don't you put them together in a book? And actually, that was my goal from the beginning. Just this morning, I got an email from Christine Gearlock, who's such a help. She works here for the Jefferson, and she's working on putting together some kind of a book event or book signing at Warner Books, and I know that many of you are familiar with that place. I also wanted to advertise the fact that we're already beginning to talk about doing a second summertime church tour here at the Jefferson. Some of you might have participated on the tour that we gave last summer. It's actually not the second. I've been teaching here at the Jefferson. Ferky, how old are we now? 20 years old? 17. Well, I was a very young man when I started teaching here 17 years ago, and have been talking about sacred spaces ever since. Last summer, though, we had a wonderful presentation, or a group that came together to talk about Erie, Pennsylvania's two cathedral churches, St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral and St. Peter Cathedral. Most folks assume that a big church is a cathedral, but certainly the 40 people who participated in this tour learned what that word really means and what constitutes a cathedral parish. What we're going to be doing in July of this year is going to two East Side churches, in large part because in Erie, Pennsylvania, a lot of folks don't even know the East Side. And it is kind of silly that we still bifurcate this town by East and West Sides. And they certainly haven't had a chance to get into St. Stanislaus Church. That's the one on the right side, or St. John the Baptist Church on East 26th Street. In this postcard photograph, by the way, you see how the facade is all worked in brick? When you pass by it today, it's all concrete block, and that Mr. William T. Spader was partly responsible for underwriting. That's just one of the things we'll learn about when we take that tour. So, Ferky, I'm not sure how soon we will have a sign-up list for that event. Maybe tonight Ferky will put it together. No, he won't be doing that, but pretty soon we will be. And it's great to see so many familiar faces here. We have the Kayleys up front. They've been following me for the last 17 years. They know all of my bad jokes and so forth. And they're probably the first couple I'll pick on this evening. Because as my wife will tell you, and my wife is here along with my in-laws, I totally revamped this presentation around Monday of this week, hoping to make it much more participatory than it was in its original iteration. And to be perfectly honest, I think I've presented here at the Jefferson multiple variations on a theme. I think I've probably talked about how we distinguish great art from low art, how we make informed opinions about works of art, because it's so necessary nowadays. I was listening to WQXR, the public radio station from New York City this morning when I was putting the finishing touches on this thing. And like all public radio, public media stations, they are frantic now about government cuts in the funding of that great access that we have, that great resource of public radio, public broadcasting. And so I hope that one of the secondary themes of my presentation tonight has to do with the fact that the arts are central to a great nation, a great city, a great people. Great people make art to express who they are. And sometimes that art is very contentious, like this painting. This is a painting many of you might know from an art history course you took in high school or college, or maybe some of you are artists and you were influenced by Goya's work. That's a painting of a subject that I suspect most people would never choose to put in their living room, and we here in America are kind of taught how to decorate our homes by looking at stuff on television and in home decoration magazines. It's the murdering, actually, the extermination of these Spanish freedom fighters in the city of Madrid by a group of soldiers that Napoleon marched into their town. 50 years later, Manet thought that subject, that format, was so compelling that he kind of replicates it in a painting of the execution of the Emperor Maximilian. Interesting how he's got that one soldier so casually loading that rifle, something that Steven Spielberg often uses in his work, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. We're going to mention Steven Spielberg. This is a piece you probably don't know about, by a pair of Chinese artists. It's called The Execution of Christ. Some of you might be saying, well, the Christ that I worship, if you read Scripture, was crucified. That's how he was exterminated. But here we have a firing squad putting to death Jesus the Christ. You can't see this very well from the photograph that I'm using here, but each of the riflemen there, each of the people with the weapons has the face of Chairman Mao. And maybe we can spend a half an hour talking about the content of that work. Speaking of Steven Spielberg, who is such a chief manipulator, he knows how to use form. He's such a brilliant artist. He knows how to manipulate us as viewers of his films. But remember this horrific scenes from Schindler's List where an officer tries to execute a hinge maker, right? Who, through no fault of his own, hasn't been able to make as many hinges as he's supposed to make. And you remember the interesting psychological wrinkle in all of this. He keeps using that Luger to try to execute the man, and the Luger freezes up, it jams up, to the point where he just throws the damn pistol at the man's head to try to kill him. I've written about Schindler's List and also Spielberg's work because I'm not quite sure what we're supposed to do while we're watching his films or after we're watching his films. By the way, how many of you have seen Schindler's List? Maybe most of us, right? How many of you remember the image of the little girl, right, in the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw, right? And we're able to track her with our eyes because Spielberg, when he made this film 20 years ago, 25 years ago, digitally colorized the little girl's coat. And there's that strange kind of fugue going on in the Jewish ghetto, even as the Jews are having their homes destroyed and so forth, and they're being kind of corralled together and executed. We're able to make sense of the little girl walking through the crowd because of that colorization. Does anybody off the top of your heads remember where we see the little girl later in the film? Anybody want to remember? We see her on the wagon, and we know it's her body being taken to be burnt in a huge pyre when these Germans realize that they have to burn the bodies that are half buried in the ground. What do you do with something like Saving Private Ryan? And what I was saying a couple of minutes ago is true. I mean, do you eat popcorn while you're looking at the first half hour of Saving Private Ryan? I mean, I've heard stories of veterans of that Normandy beach invasion who just couldn't deal with the imagery that Spielberg gave us. This is not a John Wayne movie, is it? He wants to shove our faces into the reality of the thing. In fact, I was thinking about this as I looked at this image today. I've read stories about how Spielberg had to find a truckload of little fish to drop all over that beachhead, having been informed by a veteran that all those dead fish washed up onto the beach in Normandy just as the dead bodies did. How many of you remember this one soldier, right, who loses his arm? And in the trauma of the moment, he goes and he picks it up and he carries it with him, maybe in some weird way, hoping that he can reattach it or have it reattached. Again, how do we deal with these kinds of images? Do we go out afterwards and have pizza? Do we eat popcorn and jujubes and, I don't know, other kinds of candy while this is going on? What are we supposed to do with images like this? And that's the kind of question I often put to my students. I have several of them in here. I won't embarrass them and pick them out, but they were my best students. And as you can tell from this photograph, this is the classroom where I spent most of my time for 35 years. It was a beautiful tiered classroom, but I taught in the shadow of the cross, in the shadow of the crucifix, and thought that I had some obligation to lend a certain morality to what we were discussing. Now, I wasn't trying to be moralistic. That's a totally different kind of thing. The scribes and the Pharisees were guilty of being moralistic. The most moralistic people I know are always trying to impose their morality on you or on me. People who are moral are comfortable in their sin. They understand in their skins. They understand themselves and maybe their sin too. I know I am. And don't feel the need to sell you on their faith because they believe their faith sort of shines forth in their moral action. The question I always had for the 35 students or so who sat in those introductory courses was, how do you make an informed judgment about a work of art? Because in America, as you all know, we all have our opinions and we tend to leap to judgments prematurely without feeling as if we have to legitimize our judgments. And of course, one of the great purposes of higher ed is to give people an informed way of looking at the world, a critical way of looking at the world. One of the courses I used to love to teach was called Introduction to the Visual Arts. And I suspect a lot of scholars today wouldn't want to waste their time teaching a survey course. But I loved having freshmen, for example, in my classes. Freshmen who were still full of a little bit of idealism about being educated. This course was called Introduction to Visual Arts, but the subtext says seeing, thinking, and feeling in a world of images. And I believe that my responsibility was to teach people how to refine their seeing, I taught them how to see, so I would teach them how to think more clearly and feel more deeply. And I'll tell you as a professor that the two things that my students typically did not want to do too much of was to see clearly and to think deeply, and here's a third one, to feel deeply. We've all been told to anesthetize ourselves, but how the heck can you really indulge in art if you're going to remain aloof to the imagery and the experiences the artist gives to us? This is a piece by Katie Kovitz, and some of you know that right now in the Erie Art Museum, we have an entire show of her prints. Kovitz, who presents really tough images for us, even today. I mean, many of the images deal with the effects on women and children of warfare. Many students in my class were turned off by those images and would ask a question like, how does a woman fall into making those kinds of images? And then we would have to talk about whether images are gender specific or not. What about a piece like Matthias Grünwald's Isenheim altarpiece? Many of you know this work. I got in trouble one time because in the context of a lecture about this work, I said, it's so empirically accurate, it's so scientifically accurate, that it almost presents a pornographic representation of the death of Jesus, this sort of waxy pallor that he has on his skin. He's not a Christ who we fall in love with very easily. And of course, a young man who wasn't thinking with much nuance immediately went to the dean's office, and that became pretty commonplace in the last 10 years of my career. You always go to the dean or the bishop or the president first and never go to the teacher. He said, Dr. DeSanctis is telling us that the crucifixion was pornography. Well, that wasn't what I was implicating, but I also found that my students were not very good with humor, especially humor that poked fun at the culture that they embraced. They loved being Americans if it gave them their cell phones and their shopping malls. This is a piece by Dwayne Hansen. You might say, what piece? I see a couple there in the corner of this museum, this gallery. Now, here's Mr. Hansen in his light blue suit. He's actually standing behind these poly-resin sculptures that he became famous for way back in the 1970s. And he loves dressing them. He loves going out to secondhand shows, stores, and finding the perfect appointments with which to dress these characters. The students resented the fact that this artist was obviously making fun of them, making fun of the ugly American tourists that, as many of you know who travel the world, you encounter when you're around the world. We seem to be louder and noisier and more pushy than anyone else. And that's a little bit of the implication that the artist is offering us. What my students did like, because the culture has taught them to like this, is what we call representational art. I would never allow the students to use that dirty word, the R word, realistic, right? I know we all use that. You tell me, what do you have to be prepared to define if you want to use the word realistic? Anybody? What is real, right? That's a philosophical proposition. I wasn't ready to go down that road. So instead, I use the much more technically accurate phrase, representational. It's a kind of art that represents what nature looks like. And I just said a second ago that the culture teaches us to love this kind of art. And some people, as you know, were able to make a cottage industry, not only out of cranking out images that are representational, that don't really force us to think too deeply. There's nothing wrong with still life paintings or landscape paintings, but if you're going to present a landscape image in 2025, it's going to have to be novel enough to really hold the audience's attention. Mr. Ross, who was a great guy, I guess, was able to turn all of us into little Bob Rosses. I understand, and maybe some of you are actually experts at this, that there are actually Bob Ross parties nowadays, and you too can become the next Bob Ross. It's kind of an American industry, a mass production approach to the arts that maybe is part of our bloodstream, part of our DNA. It's similar, I suppose, to being a production potter. And I have all kinds of friends who are potters and ceramicists and so forth. This gentleman, for example, didn't invent the concept of a vase or a bowl or a mug. He simply replicates the form of that thing over and over and over again to make a living. What you could say, and those of you who are art historians or historians in general or love the past, what you could say is that the Greeks who lived 25 centuries ago would probably call this approach to image making techne or techne. Obviously, it's the root of our word technique and technology. I always used to tell my students that techne was an example of a trained hand. It was the product of a hand that was well trained. That's a little different, though, from what the Romans meant when they used the word ars. You actually know this word every time you see an MGM motion picture and you're watching the lion growl at the beginning. You see that Latin phrase. I think Pope Leo used it the other day. Ars gratia artis, art for the sake of art for art's sake. What the Romans meant by ars was not just a product of an informed hand, a trained hand, somebody with technique. But and some of you who are athletes, I bet you know folks who are really good with technique, but they're still not great athletes. They're still not inventive. They still can't make things up by the seat of their pants. All they know is technique. We know artists like that as well. What the Romans meant was an example of ars, which morphed into our word arte, or art, was something that was the product not only of a trained hand, but a trained mind, which is exactly why I used to tell my students that every work of art is a proposition. The word proposition is just another word for question. Every work of art is a question answered by a question. Now, of course, this used to drive the students crazy, especially when I would tell them that I was not there to legitimize what they had learned in high school, but to get them to question everything they'd learned in high school. That's what art does. It gets us to question. It shoves us off our feet. It makes us think deeper, more deeply than we might otherwise. Art offers us what I call wise to make us wise. Now, obviously, that's just a little play on words, but did any of you have a chance to get to Cleveland, the Cleveland Museum of Art, beginning back in December and ending up in March to see the big Picasso on paper blockbuster? It was one of those big blockbuster shows, you know, that really draws a lot of people to the museum. And as you know, the Cleveland Museum of Art is a wonderful resource. And they won't charge you a dime to walk into their galleries, you know, and to look at some wonderful images. The Picasso show, though, was one of these good examples of a situation where we are presented with whys that make us wiser. Early in the show, like chronologically, you see some of Picasso's incredible drawings on paper of the human body. And you wonder how a kid, and by kid I mean somebody in his teens or somebody who's 20 years old, how could he render this illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat two-dimensional surface? If I gave all of you, all 50 of you, a pencil and some charcoal and some paper right now, how many of you could create effectively the same kind of illusion? But this man had already mastered the tradition. He knew Renaissance imagery. He had mastered the idea that what the artist does is to document what's out there in the three-dimensional world. Not necessarily to document what's inside your soul, which is a whole different kind of documentation, which may have led to him eventually painting like this. And you sort of scratch your head, right? You're there in the gallery and juxtaposed against each other were the images I just shared with you against a drawing like this. Well, of course, the typical American doesn't know the story of a drawing like this, doesn't know the whole fossil record. And they immediately assume that because this speaks in a foreign language, and we Americans don't speak foreign languages anymore, somehow the artist doesn't have technique, doesn't have techne. You and I know, however, that in order for Picasso to begin to paint that way, he had to go through what we call an Africanization period. Where's Cheryl Zhang? Cheryl, you were joking earlier about me wearing a daishiki in college. Even I tried to be African, okay? Caucasian guy with Italian blood in my veins. And when I was a freshman in college, I bought a daishiki because all of my friends wanted to be African American. It was so novel, it was so hip, it was so attractive. We wanted to take on another person's culture. That's exactly what Picasso did. I don't know if he had a daishiki, but he tried to Africanize his own art. And he learned from African tribal masks, which he found gutsy and earthy and sexual and powerful and supernatural, that you can make an illusion of a face, for example, turning in space and time, or also suggest that you can look at one object, one face, from two different perspectives at the same time. And so it sort of makes sense logically that down the road he would begin to experiment with putting an image on one plane, one two-dimensional plane, that tries to suggest to us that we're looking at a single object from multiple perspectives. He takes a musical instrument like a violin in this case, or a guitar in other cases, and you and I are like little subatomic particles, little neutrinos zipping around this object, and we're able to look at it from multiple perspectives. And the kids would say in my class, well, Dr. DeSanctis, we don't see the world that way. Well, of course we do. I mean, look at the way water, for example, will fracture the body of that straw, or refract light, or change our perception. And our perception of the world around us is based upon where we are in space and time, which are much more flexible and changeable than we ever thought. It's interesting to me that this young German physicist was in Paris at the same time that Picasso's doing this and suggesting to us that our perception of the world is relative. It all depends on where we are in space and time, or space-time. So intimate are they with each other. And at the same time that we've got Picasso there and we have Einstein there, we've got Stravinsky there, who's going through his own Africanization process. He writes this incredible score to a ballet called Le Sacre de Printemps, the Rite of Spring. John Williams stole the theme from it, the rhythmic theme, bum, 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 for JES, right? But it was so revolutionary at the beginning of the 20th century for Stravinsky to rip music apart and then reassemble it the same way Frank Lloyd Wright was doing it with architecture, the same way poets were beginning to do it, the same way Picasso was beginning to do it in his imagery. Way back at the beginning of the 20th century in Paris, people would have told Le Corbusier, this architect whom you see here, French architect, we all know what a chair is supposed to look like. This is a chair. It's basically mass. It's a mass object. What does he do? He comes along and creates this image that I was shaking my head to for the past couple of months as I put this presentation together. Look at the date of this lounge chair, 1928. It belongs in an antique store, right? It's a century old, and yet it fits in a contemporary apartment in New York City today. For this reason, artists, as many of you know who are artists, we see the world differently than others. That doesn't mean we're snobby. Frankly, half of the time our lives are terrible because we're not paid enough, we're not respected enough, but we're always pushing the envelope. You know, we have this wonderful phrase that we appropriated from military strategy, the avant-garde. The avant-garde is the front row of soldiers hitting the beach first, the front row of soldiers going in the battle. The avant-garde is really the prophetic part of a culture. And when I sank the word prophetic into my little presentation here, I meant it in both of those biblical ways. Not only do prophets tell forth, right? Prophets have the guts to say what needs to be said. We say Martin Luther King was a prophetic figure. He'd been to the mountaintop. He'd already told the country what it needed to hear, and he paid with his life. We always put prophets to death. Gandhi comes along, we kill him because he makes us feel uncomfortable. Jesus Christ comes along, we kill him. Martin Luther King comes along, we kill him. We don't like prophetic figures, but prophetic figures also tell forth, but they also foretell. They tell us what's coming down the pike because they see things that we don't see. That's exactly why John Kennedy, for example, during his administration, just embraced the arts. He believed that great nations, as I said earlier this evening, have to create great art. You know that in Italy, when you turn 18 years old, the federal government gives to you several hundred euros to spend as you'd like to on the arts. The government presumes that it's better to spend it at that end than to spend it with incarceration of the young. Funding the arts, Mr. Kennedy understood, was essential. Now, for us to go even deeper into this little discussion, we have to dissect works of art the same way science majors, or in this case, physicians or lab assistants, are ripping apart an organism in order to figure out how it's been assembled. That's the only way you'll ever understand how something's put together. And it doesn't matter whether you're majoring in business or economics or physiology, it's all the same. Ripping the phenomenon apart in order to figure how it's been assembled. What I first had to do for my students, and I'll blow this graphic up just a little bit, was to help them understand that every work of art, even bad works of art or works of art that fail, seem to have these four components. I hope none of you are colorblind because you wouldn't have seen that word subject just change color. Every work of art has to have a subject. And for the purposes of our presentation tonight, you can think of subject as being what the work of art is about, or the narrative or the story that it shares with us. Have to be a little careful because not every work of art is narrative. Not every work of art depicts something. Same thing with music, right? How many of you have a favorite musical work that doesn't have any lyrics attached? We all do, right? Right? And what moves you then? Well, it's the sound itself, the music itself. That's the abstract component of the arts that the average person just never gets because it's so nuanced, it's so demanding. So the subject is what a work of art is about. There's all kinds of subjects that arts talk about. Now, I suppose you could do philosophy for the rest of your life if you weren't an artist, but going beyond the work of a philosopher, the artist takes the subject, this idea, this narrative, and then casts it into a form, casts it into something by means of media or mediums. Medium is just a simple way of talking about the basic materials the artist has at her disposal, at his disposal. And artists will use any medium they can get their hands on, but especially those media that help them say what they want to say. You know, I know a sculptor who actually uses pyrotechnics in his work. What are pyrotechnics? Yeah, fireworks. He actually believes that if I'm going to create a three-dimensional object, let's make it huge. So, and I know that in the 70s, for example, when I was in college, out on the West Coast, they were doing all kinds of neat things with glass and with light and synthetic materials. Michelangelo Buonarroti, I've spoken about him before in these presentations, used Carrara marble because when he would whack it with that chisel of his, it held the line. It was so pristine and so beautiful. Photographers, some of you are here tonight. We have some photographers. That silver gelatin is just so seductive. Those rich grays and dark blacks and white surfaces are so powerful. But it does an artist no good to have great stories to tell, all the media she wants or mediums he wants, if the artist doesn't have the ability to cast it into a coherent form. And for those of you who have never been to art school, this will help you understand what people do when they go to a university or a college to study the arts or to become an artist by going to a full-blown art school. You spend most of your time learning how to manipulate form. You know, I mentioned Steven Spielberg before. He's such a manipulator, to a fault. He knows exactly how to get a rise out of us. How many of you remember watching Jaws a million years ago, and the second that head comes popping out of the bottom of the boat? The fact that you still remember that The fact that somehow the chemistry of your brain was changed by that image means that Mr. Spielberg knows how to manipulate form. We're going to talk a great deal today about form. And then all of this leads me to talk about content. Content was always the part that I like talking about the most. Content refers to the meaning that a work of art has, or all of the concepts and emotions and feelings that the audience brings to the work of art. Now, those of you who are listening really clearly and carefully tonight, you're probably saying, well, wait, Michael, that sounds like a lot of double talk. You just told us 2 seconds ago that subject is what a work of art is about, right? Now I just told you content is the meaning of the work of art. What's the difference? Subject, content. Again, it sounds like a lot of double talk. Well, let me share a work of art with you that I suspect most of you know about. How many of you have seen the MGM motion picture from 1940 called The Wizard of Oz? Okay, probably all of you, right? Which is why I selected it. There are a few things that we Americans have all seen, but you've seen this. If I were to toss out this question, what's the subject of this incredible motion picture? I bet in the space of just 1 minute, all 50 of us could come to a consensus about this, right? There's this goofy little kid named Dorothy. She's got a goofier little dog named Toto. There seems to be some farm hands in her farm. Her Auntie Em and Uncle Henry are around. There's a goofy woman down the road who kind of looks like a witch. She gets caught up in a terrible cyclone. She goes through this incredible pilgrimage, this sort of odyssey, only to find herself back in her bed. And the moral of the story is, there's no place like home. And the fact that you remember that means that that motion picture is effective. What about this question? What does that movie mean? Well, then we're going to have to spend the rest of the night, and Ferkie's going to have to charge us rent for sleeping here, I guess, right? We could spend an hour talking about that film. Not only about aspects of it that we could probably agree upon, but some of you who have actually lived in Kansas. I never did. I'm from upstate New York, and I've lived for 40 years in this town called Erie, Pennsylvania. Some of you who have lived through a tornado. Maybe you were around 40 years ago in the spring when that tornado ripped up Albion, Pennsylvania. Maybe some of you have an Auntie Em. Maybe some of you have a dog. I've never had a pet. So I can't bring that content, that meaning to the work of art. But you can see now how many valences, how many layers of meaning can be attached to a work of art, which is why some people are driven crazy by the arts. Art is poetry. Art is layers of meaning superimposed on top of each other. And over time, a work of art can take on meaning. You know, we know things today about that motion picture, for example, and the stars who were in it, that we bring to it. One other thing I need to tell you before we go on, and this is on your little wine list that I made sure you got on the way in. Right? If you haven't figured out, it's not really a wine list, okay? You are never going to be able to divide these two things from each other. Form and content are absolutely inseparable from each other in the arts. That's why form is so important. That's why I said Spielberg is such a manipulator. He knows how to push our buttons. I'll prove it to you really rapidly with some simple objects and simple visual things. Here's a thing I fabricated on my laptop, it's got 2 axes to it, right? A vertical one and a horizontal one. In a certain context, like a math class, an arithmetic class, I bet a lot of you would bring to this visual image something you've learned since you were a kid. That every time we see that symbol, we're supposed to think of addition, right? If I change the form of the object, I instantly change its meaning. Even if changing its form simply means changing the color. Color is one of the formal elements that artists learn about in art school. We learn about all the elements of geometry, point, line, plane, volume. We learn about color. We learn about texture. We learn about space. We learn about scale. Well, color is very important. And color is one way that we can really sort of push somebody's buttons as an artist and make them think about content, about meaning. What if I take my original cross, right? Here's the original color. I'll simply tip it on its side. I've instantly changed what it looks like, its form, and I've instantly changed what it means. In an arithmetic class, none of us would get away with thinking of this as a symbol of addition. It's about multiplication now. What if I take that simple symbol that has only two axes to it and I break those at right angles, okay, and create what they say in The Sound of Music is that ugly little spider that was developed by the Germans and the Nazis in the 1930s. Ferky, what would happen if I left the projection up all night long here at the would there be any problems there? I bet there would be, right? I bet some people would be offended by the swastika, even though some of you actually know that this is a transcultural symbol. Indigenous peoples here in America made swastikas on their teepees. The Greeks and the Romans used to have key fretting that had a swastika like this. But none of us in this room would ever not associate this symbol nowadays with that culture that came out of Nazi Germany in the 30s. Let me share another quick example with you. And I'm having some sort of, sense that I've presented this before to some of you here at the Jefferson, but it's a good example. You all know that an hour and a half west of here, we have the Cleveland Museum of Art, which I've already mentioned. And out in front of what's called the Central Pavilion, the pavilion of this building, this temple front. Because when this building was constructed, we Americans still thought of art as being so sacred it belonged in a temple, right? Most of the great museum buildings from the 1910s, 1920s, Depression era looked like temples. So do school buildings as well, right? How many school entrances do you know of that have columns and pediments? Because we Americans used to think of education as so sacred that it belonged in a temple. Well, out in front of this central portico or pavilion, we have an example of Rodin's Thinker. You've all seen this before. Or even if you simply play Jeopardy, you've heard of Rodin's Thinker from the early part of the 20th century. But this particular casting in bronze is different from any other bronze casting of the work that you'll find anywhere else in the world, because as some of you know, in March of 1970, in order to protest America's involvement in Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War, somebody attached a large explosive device to the bottom of the piece and destroyed it. Now, to the credit of the sculpture curators at the Cleveland Museum of Art, it was decided to put the piece back where it originally stood, on this big plinth, this big pedestal out front. And I love the courageousness of that action, because beauty is always having to fight ugliness. You know, ugliness is the sworn enemy of beauty. And in this republic of ours, increasingly, beauty really is on hard times. But we have here this work of art that now forces me, as somebody who loves art history, to think about the Vietnam War and the politics of the 1970s, even though I would rather just look at the Rodin work and understand it as a work of beautiful anatomy. That's how closely related form and content are. To go even further, I always made sure that I taught my students something called the critical method. And that phrase probably should not have the definite article "the" in front of it, because there are multiple critical methods, multiple ways of critiquing a work of art. We're kind of adverse to critiquing in our culture today. We don't like to critique each other. We don't like to criticize each other. We all have our separate truths, Oprah tells us, and as long as I don't step on your feet, I can live by my own truth, which isn't even logically possible if you know philosophy. Anyway, beyond that, Oprah and all that stuff. What about the critical method? How do we critique a work of art? Well, there are 4 steps to this process, and it's only coincidental that there are 4 elements in a work of art. That sometimes confuses students. And what we need to do is to go through all of these 4 steps. We need to go through the first 3 steps, I believe, to earn the right to go through the 4th step. Again, unfortunately, in our American culture today, everybody immediately goes to judgment. We love to judge everything, assess everyone, without doing our homework first. Let's see if we can apply this technique, this method, to a single work of art. This is just a work that I like by an artist whom I like as well. His name is George Tooker. He was very popular in the 1950s. He's an American. He used a kind of magical realism that I love so much. And the first thing we're going to want to do in our heads, mentally without telling anybody at all. You simply describe the phenomenon, the organism, the thing that's in front of us. I'll start you off. I'll show you how this works. What I see, and I'm going to begin my sentence with that phrase, what I see is a woman. I'm guessing it's a woman. I can kind of tell by the suggestion of her hair. She seems to be sitting at a vanity or a table of some kind. I don't think it's a kitchen table because I kind of see the suggestion of maybe a string of pearls. Do you see those as well? And that little formal detail, that little puzzle piece has been given to us by the artist to set us up to bring something, like the word vanity, or, she's in a domestic setting looking into a mirror. I think I can get away with that, a handheld mirror. Anything else that you folks think I should add to my description, my cataloging of what's contained in this work of art? Anybody?
What's behind her?
What is behind her? I see a skull. Do you think that's significant?
No, it's not a skull, it's a mask.
Well, we're not sure. Okay, that's good, Bill. You're going to cause problems, aren't you, Bill? And I love the fact that, see, there are multiple layers of possibility. What we'll have to do is push us even further, Bill, and make sure we can determine whether it really is a skull or whether it really is a mask. I'm kind of guessing that if you look at the nose of that skull and the fact that it doesn't have a tip to it, it probably is the skeletal remains of a human face. Now, let me show you a little trick. And Gary back there, who's a photographer, and those of you who are painters and photographers and artists and so forth, you already know this trick. It's a marvelous trick. Let's tip this thing upside down so now our eyes are disengaged from subject. We're no longer looking at a woman holding a mirror with a skull or a mask behind her at a vanity. It's just images on a two-dimensional surface. This actually might be a lithograph, okay, printed on paper. And what if I were to ask you this question? What if we were simply to do a linear analysis and try to come to grips with the kinds of lines the artist has used? Do you think that's a pretty juicy line right there, that horizontal line? I think so. Do you think these lines, these repeated lines here are? I think so as well. And an implied line is there at the tip of the head that we just saw. And I suggest this to you because you can see how the artist has really kind of bracketed all the important subject material into one part of the picture plane, what artists call the picture plane. What if we were to examine this for what we like to say in class are the curvilinear shapes, shapes that are actually outlined by curved lines? We're going to have to talk about that, aren't we? Right? Doesn't your eye go right there? What about the woman's head? I know that the human head, if you take an anatomy class, you kind of learn this, is an ovoid. But I don't think I've ever seen, here, let's go back one click. I don't think I've ever seen a head quite as egg-shaped as that one. Do you think the artist stylized it? Why do you think he did that? What is he drawing attention to? Or what is he connecting? The mirror and the head, right? Is there anything else that's ovoid? Well, there it is. It's that skeleton or skull we see, okay? And we could also talk about maybe the way he, again, sort of divides the picture plane up into parts. We could talk about what artists often describe as the negative space. But we've got to go through all of that hard work in order to interpret the image. And my wife is a physician, and she often talks about patients presenting symptoms to her. She never says to the patient, she never says into her dictaphone, she never says into her fancy, technology today, it's my feeling that, or it's my opinion that, or I feel this way. It's always rooted in her assessment, her analysis of the phenomenon in front of her. And then she can interpret it. She can present, a sound interpretation of what might be wrong with a patient, for example. Let's interpret the work of art. Interpretation means bringing meaning and invisible emotions and ideas and concepts to the work. And again, there are going to be as many interpretations of this lithograph as there are people in this room tonight. If you happen to be a young person, preoccupied with your complexion, you might think about a woman looking into a mirror in a fairly superficial way. If you're in your 70s or 80s or even beyond and you begin to look into that mirror and you can't recognize the person whose reflection you see, you're going to bring something else. If you were raised by your mom or dad reading books to you by wonderful fairy tales about magical mirrors, you're going to bring all of that content to the interpretation of the work. And it's only then that you've earned the right to judge it, to decide whether you think it's stronger or more effective or less strong, less effective than all the other hundreds of images you've seen in your life that have the very same subject. I mean, the last image you saw there on the, the right-hand side is by Picasso. Here's a 20th century artist. The first one I popped on there was from the 1600s, the 17th century. This is one of those perennial motifs or ideas that artists have played with forever. Now let's talk a little bit about the tricky business of moral judgments, because they often get us in trouble. Again, especially today, because there is so much contentious information out there. I would say that probably most of the contents of this file of mine, and you're welcome to take a look at it later, is made up of imagery that somehow presses our buttons on a moral level, or really makes us think very deeply about moral issues. This is actually a painting by William Bailey. He used to teach at Yale. He passed away several years ago. Bailey loves human anatomy. He also loves still life paintings. And some of you might scratch your head and say to yourself, I could never really figure out why artists would spend their time painting images like this of a carafe or some kind of a cup or a mug or an egg. Why would you waste your time doing that? But you see, artists love geometry. And geometry also shows up in human anatomy. And you often find that figurative artists, and William Bailey made a living being a figurative artist, love painting still lives. They love painting the human body. Now, here's a typical example of one of the works by William Bailey. A woman, sort of an understated image of a woman. She's pulled down her blouse. And, you know, it was kind of important for me to tell you, first of all, that Bailey loves geometry because, as I used to tell my students, this painting really is about geometry, just as much as it is about anatomy. Unfortunately, again, because we live in the country that we do live in, and we haven't taught our children how to see, they look all the time. They're constantly looking at those damn cell phones of theirs, but they can't see. This painting got Mr. Bailey in trouble, not because of anything he did, but we just can't deal with those circles on the body of this woman. I'll prove it to you. Way back in 1982, that seems like a lifetime ago, Newsweek magazine decided to carry a cover story on the revival of, well, there's that dirty word, realism. Why do you think the editors chose to reproduce this painting by William Bailey? Anybody, even if it's obvious?
Sales.
Why? Why say? Why would this cover sell magazines?
Because it is provocative.
Yeah, and you wonder, why provocative? The Europeans aren't necessarily like this. Those breasts, I mean, they used to serve a function, right? They were for feeding babies, right? Well, right, but we treat them like hood ornaments in this country now, right? We don't understand the female body. We've sexualized it to the point where we can't look at a nude figure like this. And that's something that I began to see during the last, let's say, 10 years of my career. I taught at Gannon for 35 years. I would say that in the last decade, I began to see the great effect that pornography was having on my students, especially my male students. It was impossible for them to discern the difference between nudity and nakedness. Every nude figure was naked for them. It was a sexual object. Now, Bill Cayley's laughing because there was this op-ed piece or this commentary in visual form in the New York Times, and we see here that the owners of this museum have decided to put Speedo bathing suits and diapers on all the great classical nude figures. One guy says to the other, it all started with the complaints about the nude on the cover of Newsweek. And we Americans have to learn how to discern the difference between nakedness and nudity. Maybe it means you're going to have to do some homework. Sir Kenneth Clark, great British art historian, way back in the 60s, wrote a huge compendium. It's about 800 pages thick, called The Nude. that will help you understand the beauty of the human body. Sometimes students ask me, my students would say, Dr. DeSanctis, you were in art school and you told us that you had 9 hours of life drawing every Monday, Wednesday, Friday as a freshman. Wasn't that like sexually provocative? And I'll tell you, the last thing you're thinking about as you're drawing the hips or the shoulders or the breasts or the pelvis is sexuality. You're thinking of geometry. Just as, my wife Kelly and I have discussions about this. When she was taking anatomy classes, physiology classes, the last thing that they were able to do in those courses would snicker or make a joke about a cadaver, or snicker or make a joke about the human form. Let me show you, however, the danger you get into and the slippery slope that you travel if you superimpose moral judgments on something prematurely, or you forget that your job is really to assess the aesthetic content of a work of art, not its moral content, okay? Here's another work of art at the lovely Cleveland Museum of Art. I love that resource because it's a testament to the people of Cleveland that they've endowed the place to the tune that you and I don't have to support it through our dollars, our pennies. Instead, the city, a great city of Cleveland, has a great art museum. This is a painting by Jakob Ockvelt. It's called A Musical Company. Like a long time ago, 1668. That's a long time ago. The subject of this work of art seems to be a group of men and women. I love their luxurious costume. And don't you just love the crimson that woman is dressed in? She's playing the fiddle. Imagine what that says about Dutch culture. The fact this woman is not only literate, not only can she read words, but she can read music. And she's entertaining these men. One is playing some kind of a flute that you see there, or recorder. In the background, we see a conversation going on between another woman and another man in sort of the darker, shadowy parts of this building. What you can't see very well, and I had to highlight this digitally, is that around the walls of this very dark 17th century painting, you see portraits of the women who work in this house. The only other time I think I've seen a similar kind of thing is when I visited Pompeii. Have any of you ever been to Pompeii, the Roman colony? They take you into the brothels, and they show you that on the walls of the brothels, the Romans painted frescoes depicting the different kinds of activities you could choose in those places. Because that's exactly what we're looking at. This is a 17th century depiction of something that still shows up in the streets of Amsterdam today. The Dutch are among the most liberally minded people in the world. We have the Dutch Reformed Church there, but still the Dutch tolerate all kinds of ways of thinking and acting. Is my job to critique the morality of prostitution? Not in this case. I'm a Catholic Christian. I believe that prostitution is wrong because it turns a woman's body into an object. It turns my body into an object. We fought a very bloody civil war in this country because we believe that everyone is a person, not an object. But at the moment, I can say to myself, I'll put that all aside, and I love the crimson that I see pasted on that beautiful canvas. And frankly, if I can't deal with prostitution and prostitutes as they are painted, what am I going to do with the Toulouse-Lautrec? We know that he at night would go out late at night, much later than most of us, right? Come back early in the morning. And many of the women that he would sort of hang out with were, in fact, prostitutes. He paid them not for sex, but for their time, or he befriended them because they were such wonderful models. Or what do we do with even a work by Donatello, one of the great Renaissance masters? We need to know that even though Scripture never identifies Mary Magdalene as a prostitute, Western tradition certainly does. And look, he shoves our face right into the reality of her condition, right? Her body is ravaged because of the way she has spent her life. Sin has done that to Mary Magdalene, who loved Christ so much. Those of you who've ever seen Michelangelo's Pietà, you're looking at just the opposite, right? Michelangelo believes that Mary, the mother of Christ, was born without original sin. She was sinless throughout her life. She was preserved from sin. So she lacks the very thing that causes our bodies to age and become corrupt. Not so Mary Magdalene, right? who live such a life of sin that we see it embodied in the work of art. The artist is saying, this is what sin looks like. This is what happens when we go down the wrong moral path. But at this moment, I'm not playing theologian or philosopher. I often tell the students that sometimes we have to briefly suspend our moral opinions or positions in order to see a work of art more clearly. For the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking about how this applies to music as well. Same thing applies to music, right? Why have I been thinking about this for the past couple of weeks? Well, remember how 2 weeks ago the Erie Philharmonic hosted a tribute show, right, for the Beatles? How many of you were there for that? I was there for that, right? Now, my own parents would not listen to the Beatles in the 1960s, 60 years ago. Number one, because their hair was too long. Number two, because they were too damn loud. Number three, because of the way they gyrated their hips, the way Elvis did, right? And you've all heard this story about how on the Ed Sullivan Show, they only dared televise Elvis from the top up. They weren't going to allow us to see him gyrating in a sexual way. But when I was there with my family, I took this photograph at the Erie Phil event a couple of weeks ago. I saw at least 3 generations of people. I saw folks in their 90s. I saw folks my age in their 60s. I saw folks in their 30s. A little boy next to me was 6 years old, and we were all enjoying the Beatles. And I suggest that because time, it can be an asset to us, a friend to us. Allow time, allow history to help you make a moral appraisal of a work of art. Can any of us in this room say that we would want to live in a world today without a song like Eleanor Rigsby, or Blackbird, or Hey Jude, or Let It Be? They're part of the fossil record now of who we are. And they caused me to tear up as I thought about how beautiful those songs were, written so many years ago by a kid from Liverpool in his 20s. Sometimes the possibility of being offended is the price we pay for living in a nation that values free expression. I don't think I would like to have lived in the culture that produced the man who in turn produced this watercolor. This is a beautiful landscape by a very unbeautiful man. Some of you know that Adolf Hitler was a frustrated artist, but he only believed that art could depict what's out there. It had to depict things that were rational and logical and easy to understand. He didn't want poetry, he wanted prose. In fact, he made it a law. He said works of art from now on have to be easily understood or they're never going to make their way into the hands of the German people. By fiat, he made it clear that art wasn't to look anything like this, for example. This is Van Gogh's attempt to depict a landscape. And I can't imagine living in a universe without Van Gogh today. Can you? Hitler looked at this and said, well, come on, the sky is never yellow like that, cadmium yellow. We can't allow that. We can't allow Matisse to destroy the landscape. And some of you know this stuff better than I do. What was the word that Hitler used to love to use for any culture or thing or person that he thought was less than himself?
Degenerate.
Degenerate. This was degenerate art, okay? But you and I know better. Think of it this way. How many of you were at the Erie Phil's presentation of the Verdi Requiem this past weekend? If you look really carefully, you can see me. I'm that really tall guy in the back, and you can actually hear me, I think. The Erie Philharmonic, we had 200 performers on the stage performing Verdi's masterpiece, the Requiem, okay? Why is it that the Erie Philharmonic hands out programs? Because we presume, we know that not everyone in that audience knows how to speak Latin, knows the shape of the Mass, knows the meaning of the Mass, cares about Verdi, understands classical music. So going to this event becomes an educational experience. That's one of the goals of the Erie Philharmonic. It entertains and it educates. That's what great art does. It makes us more than we are. It makes us more than ourselves by pointing us in a higher direction. We give out programs so that people will understand better what's going on. We could relinquish our authority, right? In fact, I was thinking maybe that we should do that. We'll just turn all of this over to Doge, okay? We'll make a bureau out from them called the Bureau for Efficient Expression, okay? And art, you never have to explain. We'll let DOGE determine what we can look at or not look at. You say, Michael, that's never going to happen. Well, be careful. Do you know that the White House, again, since Mr. Trump came into power, has issued some guidelines for architects? And architects in America are a little jittery about this. The White House is telling us that now all federal buildings have to have the classic face of a pedimented temple, like a Greek or a Roman temple. Does that mean that Mies van der Rohe's federal building in Chicago has to go out, along with the Calder in front of it? Or that the Federal Square in Boston has to go out? Or that in Erie, Pennsylvania, we have to take a bulldozer to everything west of that beautiful old Renaissance palace that we call our federal building? You might say, well, why would you make a big deal of this stuff anyways? What's wrong with classical architecture? If I were a black person, an African American, given the history of the courts and black people in this country, especially in the South, I'd be a little jittery about that reference. Or what if I were a slave, or my great-grandparents were slaves on a plantation that had a neo-Roman, neo-Greek antebellum mansion? I'd be a little jittery about that form. Form carries content, it carries meaning. All of that politics aside, let's try our hands at looking at some works of art, okay? And this is the part that I hope will be much more participatory. How are we doing on terms of time so far? We're halfway into this? All right. And I'm going to start in a strange way. You know, when I was in college in the mid-'70s, late '70s, nobody in an art school would ever have touched Norman Rockwell. The presumption was he was just so old hat and inconsequential when you think about it. He was basically thought of as an illustrator. Most of my professors were second and third generation abstract expressionists. They never talked about content. They loved form. They loved talking about paint and color and texture and light and scale, which is fine. But as you all know, in the mid-'60s, early '60s, along comes somebody like Jasper Johns, and along comes somebody like Robert Rauschenberg. Along comes our friend from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Andrew Varhala. And they give us the recognizable object once again, these great pop artists. They made it legitimate to have recognizable subject. You know, this is pretty explicit, a Campbell's soup can, a commercial commodity. And by the way, I popped this in here this afternoon. If you go to the spring show at the Erie Art Museum right now, you'll notice that so many postmodern artists, because we are clearly in a postmodern phase now. Even modernism is old hat. We've even transcended modernism. You'll find that representational art has flourished in the years since I was in college. Why do I say that? Well, again, there was a time when nobody would have talked about Norman Rockwell in any kind of academic situation because he was thought to be an illustrator. But then people began to scratch their heads and they said to themselves, okay, he was an illustrator for something like the Saturday Evening Post. He got paid for his work. But didn't Michelangelo Buonarroti, when he painted the Sistine Chapel, that might have been papal money, but he was an illustrator. So let's look at a single work by Norman Rockwell that I've always enjoyed sharing with my students that I still think carries some questions for us today. This is a piece from 1963. I'll start you off and then you can fill in the blanks, okay? What I see with my eyes in this work is a little girl. I'm going to stop right there. Anybody want to fill this in? A little girl dressed in white. Okay, hold on to that. Good. A little black girl. Do you think the whiteness of the dress points out the blackness of her skin? Yes. I sure do, and I think the artist knows that. Where do you think she's going?
School.
How do we know?
Ruler.
And do you think the artist wanted us to know that? Yeah, so he made damn sure that we see that little puzzle piece. Our head is frantically trying to create what psychologists call a gestalt. We're putting together all these puzzle pieces. She's going to school, walking to school. I love the fact that she's got the cleanest sneakers in the world. They're white too, right? Maybe they're Red Ball Jets. Maybe they're, right? Maybe they're Keds. Who are those four gentlemen? Yeah, because we can see the armbands, right? What do you think is tucked in the pocket of the guy in the light suit? Court order, right? And the artist allows us to make that leap. Okay, anything else that you want to catalog? And you guys are great. You just got A's. I didn't hear anybody said, well, I feel this is about man's, terrible, whatever. This is about racism. You've withheld that feeling at this point. Is there anything else that you think we need to describe at this point? Okay, what writing? What do you see? The N-word, okay? I also see way over there on the left-hand side, do you see KKK? Way over there? All right. Maybe that's a little heavy-handed. What about that tomato? How do you think it got there? Okay, we see it sort of made a splatter on the wall, so somebody must have thrown it, okay? Let's do our little trick. Let's whip this thing upside down. See, now we're disengaged. It's not a little black girl in a white dress and a tomato. It just forms on a plane. Are there any straight lines, horizontal lines, that you think are significant? Yes. Yeah, how about that one right there? And isn't it neat that Rockwell uses the bottoms of the coats of the marshals, right, to help define that line? What about the sidewalk joint? Yeah. And then the elbows, the break in the elbows suggests another. This thing is so tightly constructed, there's no way we're going to not be able to understand it. And then what about those incredibly strong triangular forms? We know from geometry class how stable triangles are, even the triangles in the gables of your house. Does anybody want to attempt, let's say we've gone through the whole discussion of texture, color, anybody want to attempt an interpretation? And in this case, let's just talk about, well, let me toss out a question to you. Those of us who are Caucasian and middle class, can we understand this painting, or do we have to be black and do we have to be female? What do you think? Ma'am, do you want to talk? Please, go ahead.
I think that, no, you do not have to. It sends a very strong message.
So we, as white folks, we can empathize with that little girl?
Yeah.
I've never been a girl in my life,
Okay.
and I've never been African American. But I feel something for her, too. Every time I see this image, and I've seen it a million times, I'm able to empathize with her. That's what great art does. Some of you said that in the background, we have the N-word. Right? It's a tough word. In our culture, we can't even say it today. Should we just get rid of it? Would that be better? And I did that with my fancy little computer. Does that make it easier and less contentious? Or does that cheat us? Do we need to see the N-word there? Yes. I agree. Is the artist being prophetic, especially in this day and age, by using that word in a work of art? Yeah, and then maybe afterwards we go out for coffee with each other or beer and we discuss the meaning of that word and the nature of this whole thing. Here's a little girl being marshaled literally to grade school in the 60s when integration began to be enforced in the South. What do we do with the works of somebody like Leonard Baskin? Leonard Baskin was a very devout Jew. In fact, his dad was a rabbi. He studied at Jewish colleges. This is a work of art by Leonard Baskin I've always enjoyed. It's called Man of Peace. It's a woodcut. What that means technically is anywhere where you see white paper, you know the artist has had to carve the meat away, the fabric away from a big piece of wood. Then he uses a brayer to put the ink over the surface of the wood, runs the whole thing through a printing press, and the press is able to transfer the ink to the surface of the paper. He calls it Man of Peace. I've always told my students that the title often sort of puts us in the right direction, okay? And we have a man, I guess I can go ahead and say that, a male figure. He's wading through a plane or an entanglement of, what is that stuff? How do you know it's barbed wire? Yeah, he exaggerates the barbs, doesn't he? He wants us to see the barb. Do you think he's a rancher from the Midwest or a farmer?
Yeah.
And the fact that you're laughing means no. And you tell me, in 2025, anyone who's lived in the West, what are we going to associate that barbed wire with? The Holocaust, right? It's almost natural, especially given the title that the guy has given us, okay? What about that shirt that only comes down to his waist? as he wades through this barbed wire, does that remind us of a situation that we've seen before? And we're still coming to grips with this. How could human beings do this to other human beings? Do I need to be a Jew to understand this work? I don't think so. I think I need to be a human being. And if this is called man of peace, what are we to make of the form of that bird? First of all, what kind of a bird do you think it is, or could be? Could be a pheasant? Yeah, okay, a dead one, right? By means of form, even though the artist has been dead for many years, he's gotten us here in this room tonight to say it might be a dead bird. So that bird of peace, maybe a dove, right? It's not the triumphant bird that Picasso celebrates, where we see all those weapons sort of destroyed there, and peace wins the victory. Instead, this poor guy is wading through barbed wire, and he's still courageous enough, though he knows that his idealism might have been challenged by the situation that he's in. What about the work of Margaret Bourke-White? And I don't mean this to be redundant in any way, but Margaret Bourke-White is a wonderful and wonderfully heroic artist. She's a photographer, large-scale camera that she carries around. You see her at the top of the Chrysler Building in New York City. I don't think I would be out there myself. By redundancy, I don't mean that I want to turn this into a discussion of race, but this is a classic photograph by Margaret Bourke-White, who used magazines to prick the conscience of middle-class white Americans. In the old days, we had those large format magazines like Look or the Saturday Evening Post. And the camera is an incredible tool. I used to use the camera in my class as a disciplining tool, because for an artist to make a work of art like this, she has to look through a viewfinder, okay? So she has to frame what she wants to share with us. And then she has another opportunity. In the darkroom, she can crop the image as she projects the negative onto a piece of photographic paper. She can crop, she can make decisions. That's just a fancy way of saying that we can hold her responsible for everything we see in this photograph. Do you think there's irony in this photograph? Let's do this. Let's go by DeSanctis' rule. Let's describe the work of art. Who wants to be strong enough, bold enough to tell me what they see with their eyes? Anybody?
Discrepancy.
Okay, Bill. Well, go back 10 spaces, because you don't have the right yet to use the word discrepancy. Tell me what you see with your eyeballs.
A slogan.
Okay, a slogan on what?
Standard of living.
On a billboard, right? Some kind of a billboard or something like that. What else do you see? Anybody?
I see a group of white people that look very happy, like they're living the American way. They got the dog, they import dog, they got the child. Everybody looks like this is how it has to be.
Even the dog, laughing, smiling, Cheryl. Even the dog is white, Cheryl. But let me go back a step. Is that really a white family walking around, or it's a depiction of a white family on a poster, right? We have to be that disciplined. Is that image juxtaposed against other kinds of folks? Yeah. Everyone down below seems to be dark-skinned, right? Even the light-complected little boy that you see down there in the corner. What kind of a line do you think they're in? Could be. And how did the artist get us to say that? Because she's been dead for a long time. The baskets, the pails. See, you and I are frantically trying to put together these puzzle pieces. Whip the thing upside down. We realize that she saw this. She framed this in her little viewing frame, right? And she probably saw this nice curvilinear shape. There's a guy wire that seems to be in the frame there that seems to be of the same angle as the window wipers and some of the other elements in that window frame. I'm sure that she saw that. What can we learn from something like this? Cheryl, you said irony, or kind of a juxtaposition of the white middle-class family with a brand new car, and then all the folks in Louisville, Kentucky who live on the floodplain. Kind of reminds us of what happened in other parts of the world recently. What about the work of Edvard Munch? Forgive me if I'm going too quickly through this, but I want to get you out at a decent time. Edvard Munch, the great Norwegian artist. Here's a self-portrait of Edvard Munch. And Jessica Nelson, you're going to get this one. Jessica Nelson, what kind of an image is this? Is she still there? It's a memento mori, right? Because you said that one time in another lecture. And we see his head sort of floating in this nebulous plane, and then down below, his skeletal remains, right? He was not a very happy man. You might know that Edvard Munch, who is the man who gave us this work, sometimes called Anxiety, sometimes called The Scream. I know that several years ago when Time magazine did a cover article on guilt and anxiety, it used this classic work by Munch. He had many deaths in his family that he had to suffer. This is called the death room. We used to believe that death brings a family together. Psychologists now tell us that it actually shatters a family and makes people little automatons. And he had bad relationships with women. This is a piece called The Vampire, where a man's lover is basically deriving the blood from him by. And this is a piece called Madonna, but she's not like any Madonna I know of in Christian religious art. She kind of looks seductive, and I don't know if you can make this out, but on the left side of the picture plane, I can see her kind of being very coy and holding her arm behind her head. She's sort of a seductress. She shows up in this lithograph. What are those little cells that are swimming around the frame of this piece called the Madonna? They're spermatozoa. So we know that this is the first example of that microscopic organism actually being depicted. And who's that little creepy figure down there at the bottom? Could be a baby or an embryo, a fetus, right? He looks a little terrified. And does she look like she wants to really be a Madonna? Probably not. We can make speculations about what that's all up to. But that's not the work I want to share with you. I want to share with you a work that also got phone calls made to the dean and the bishop and president. And anyway, this is a piece called Puberty. And you can see the date there. If this piece was made in the 1890s, that means we were building St. Peter Cathedral at 10th and Sass around the time this painting was made. It's an old painting. And late Victorian women, little girls used to dress like this. But we have a girl, you tell me where we find her. In a bedroom. It could be any room, but the artist puts her on a bed. Of all the pieces of furniture, he gives us this loaded piece of furniture that has all kinds of sexual content. And how old do you think she is? Yeah, and you can imagine why the kids in my class had said, Dr. DeSanctis is showing porno in class, which I would never do. And you can also see how close he's coming to creating what in the late 20th century would become non-representational work by people like Rothko. What are we to make of that incredible Geist or ghost and the diagonal lines that seem to suggest it's leaving the girl? Do you think she's gaining something? Or is she losing something? What is she losing at the time of puberty? Her childhood, her innocence? What do you think that bed is going to imply for the rest of her life? A woman. All kinds of stuff, right, that we could talk about. And we know that girls in our culture are actually experiencing puberty at younger and younger ages because of the stuff that we now ingest. Do you think, well, let's go ahead. Let me juxtapose that. And Gary, you might want to comment on the work of this woman. Let's juxtapose that against a photographer named Sally Mann. Sally Mann got into trouble several years ago by publishing this suite of photographs, her own photographs. It's called At 12, Portraits of Young Women. And many of the women in the photographs are her own children, who are kind of prematurely sexualized, adultified. They're in suggestive poses. So it raises a really tough question for all of this. Is her daughter, is she using her children, or is this perfectly legitimate? Is this art, or is this an example of pornography? What would you say? Is it art or pornography? If I were to leave this slide up in Fergie's beautiful little lecture room, would I possibly be arrested tonight? Or do you think Fergie should give me a raise? Anybody want to just dare one? Any commentary?
The moral aspect that you talked about,
Okay.
So,
Yeah, and I'm not sure I would be able to just, yes, way back there?
I think that it's pretty true to life. I was a 12-year-old girl
Okay.
who wore these things. I think the reason why we're offended is because it's kind of voyeuristic
All right.
to people to death.
Do you think Americans are voyeuristic by nature? Yeah, one of my favorite photographers is Dion Arbus, and I think she proved that. We're all voyeurs. We love to look upon this sort of nubile little girl, and it's something that's sort of kept from us. I share it with you only because it makes us think and feel and ask the same sort of questions that the work by Munch does. Is that a symbol, a sign?
No, we are recording this.
Oh, okay.
We need to see you a little bit.
Oh, okay. To identify me when you turn me over to the police? What do we do about religious imagery? I mean, most of you who are Christians would say, well, my Christ doesn't look like that on the cross. I find this terribly offensive. Or an Italian artist several years ago did this to the traditional crucifix. Or you've all read about Andres Serrano's piece from 1987, which now seems like a lifetime ago, called Piss Christ. Even the title seems offensive. You might say, well, Michael, you're being awfully hands-off about all of this. Well, look at it from a different perspective. If you go to the College of William and Mary, you know, there's an entire building, entire wing of their original building, their 17th century building, which is a chapel. It's got antiphonal seating in it. It was originally made for Episcopal services. And on the altar that you see there, surrounded by that balustrade, that chancel bar, there was at one time a Christian cross. Now, this space is used for honors classes, it's used for weddings, it's used for all kinds of activities. So a couple of years ago, the president of William and Mary decided to get rid of that altar cross, and that's when the firestorm began. But how would you feel if you were a Muslim student, or a Hindu student, or a Sikh, or an atheist? This school has to accommodate the vision, the voices of everyone. If that cross is offensive, what do you do with it? Do you leave it there? Do you put it on casters and move it around selectively? I share these questions with you because these are the questions that need to be asked. Which leads me to kind of close things on the work of Thomas Eakins, because he was a Pennsylvanian. Some of you know of Thomas Eakins. Thomas Eakins loved human anatomy so much that he actually enrolled in anatomy courses at the Jefferson College of Medicine in Philly. I've always wanted to know who that one woman was in this surgical theater. And he begins to depict what he sees in the surgical theaters of his anatomy classes. This is a piece called The Agnew Clinic. And Thomas Eakins had a great reputation in Philadelphia until he began to depict these scenes. And in late Victorian society, they once again used this word pornography. We're not going to look at this stuff. This is unheard of. It's terrible. This is not art. This is something less than art. The Greek word pornos means soiled. Graphis means to depict. This is pornographic. Or a piece called The Gross Clinic. This is not gross anatomy. It's the name of that teaching physician with the scalpel in his hand. Another work of art that the typical American would probably never take a look at. It's a large painting. But in that sense, it's similar to an earlier large painting that we have to come to grips with, because maybe this painting legitimizes what the artist Eakins is doing in the 19th century. But this is by a painter whose name happens to be Rembrandt. Teaching physician. He's got his interns around him. They're all looking past the cadaver at the big book there, the big anatomy book. And the artist shows us that incredible pulley system that we call the human arm that is just so marvelous. If you're going to look at a work of art like this today, and thank you for being so patient with me for the past hour and a half, I guess, then you have to sort of keep in mind what John Gardner said many years ago. He was a Chaucer scholar, a novelist. He said, every true work of art has to be judged primarily, though not exclusively, by its own laws. It makes up its own laws. Art makes no laws, only very difficult and complicated suggestions. So I guess all of us have to come to grips with that and realize that in the end, what art does is to toss out to all of us possibilities, suggestions, and ways of thinking and feeling that, in fact, transcend everyday experience. Thank you for being so patient tonight. Thank you.